Okay, for today's review, we are going to start talking about solving quadratics and all the different ways we did that. So we're going to start with square roots and factoring today. So take it nice and easy. Before we start talking about solving, let's just kind of review what the heck solving is. So if you remember, when we have a quadratic equation, sometimes that quadratic equation crosses the x-axis. And if you find those x-intercepts, that's also the same as finding its solutions or finding its roots or finding its zeros, because that's where it's equal to 0 on the y-axis. And when we have a graph, that's really easy to find. You just look for those points. But if we just have equations, we needed to come up with some mathematical ways or algebraic ways to find those two values where it crossed the x-axis. So we're going to go through a variety of ways that we learned to find those solutions from the equation. And the first one we're going to talk about is that square root. So if you remember, when we use square roots is when the value does not have that linear term, or when that equation does not have that linear term. So it'll have an x squared, it'll have a number x squared, or it'll have a number x squared equal to 0. So it will look like one of these forms right here. So you'll have x squared equals a number times x squared equals a number, or a number x squared plus another number equals 0. So how do we go about solving this? Well, it's pretty simple. First, we're going to get x squared by itself. So we're going to add and subtract if we need to. We're going to multiply and divide if we need to, so that x squared is the only term on one side and all of the numbers are on the other side. Then we're going to undo that x squared by taking the square root. You also are always going to have a positive and a negative value when you take the square root. So you should have two answers there. You might have to simplify that square root. Remember, we talked about finding all those prime factors and finding our pairs if necessary. So you might have to simplify that square root, positive and negative values. And finally, if you have a negative square root, remember that makes an imaginary solution, so you need to have an I value in there along with your simplified square root. So let's take a look at a couple examples. So first example is x squared equals 45. So if my problem says x squared equals 45, well, that makes my life really easy. I don't have to add, I don't have to subtract, I don't have to multiply, I don't have to divide, because all my numbers are on one side and x squared's on the other side. Take the square root, that's going to cancel out that squared. Then I have to simplify the square root of 45. So remember, I go through and I simplify that out to 3 times 3 times 5. Because I have a pair of 3's, I move them to the outside, and that means the square root of 45 simplifies into 3 square root 5. Because it's a square root, remember, it's also negative 3 square root 5. All right, next one. If I have 3x squared equals 45, then I'm going to go ahead and try to get rid of this 3 by dividing by 3 on both sides first. If I do that, I get x squared equals 15. Now that x squared's by itself, I'm going to take the square root, and then I need positive square root 15, negative square root 15. Remember, you cannot simplify square root of 15 because its factors are just 3 and 5, and there's no pairs there. So this answer is square root of 15 and negative square root of 15. Now, I didn't draw an example of this, but if you had it, let's say 3x squared plus a number equals another number, remember you'd have to do that addition and subtraction first and then divide by your 3. Finally, let's take a look at one with an imaginary example. So if I started with x squared equals negative 49, then I'm going to take the square root on both sides. That might make this easy with the square root of 49 because we know that's 7, but that negative is a problem. Remember, the negative is how we get that I value. So I'm going to take my negative 49 and I'm going to separate it into negative 1 and positive 49. And then I'm going to make the square root of negative 1 the I value. Square root of 49 is, of course, 7. So now I have plus or minus I times 7, which gives you plus or minus 7I. So those are all my examples for solving with a square root. Again, here's your steps. Going through x squared equals number, ax squared equals a number, or ax plus c equals 0. Okay, so there's your steps and your examples. All right, next kind of solving we're going to talk about is solving quadratics by factoring. So again, we're trying to find those roots from our equation. This time we're going to have a factorable equation. And remember, we talked last 2 classes ago about factoring, and you practiced last class how to factor. We have regular factoring, and then we have slide and divide factoring, so you might have to do both of those things. But the whole idea here is that once you have factored your expression, how do you find those solutions? Well, you find those solutions by using the zero product property, which tells you that you should take those 2 parentheses and set them equal to 0. Okay, so if you take a look at a factored expression, so pretend I already factored and I ended up with x minus 1 and x plus 3 as my factors. When I want to try to solve from here, I'm going to set each parentheses equal to 0. So I take x minus 1, set it equal to 0, then I would add 1 to both sides and get x equals 1. And if I take x plus 3, set it equal to 0, subtract 3 on both sides, then I get x equals negative 3. So one of the things you need to make sure that you do after you've factored is go through and set each of those parentheses equal to 0. So let's take a look at a whole problem from start to finish. So again, here are your steps. You're going to set your problem equal to 0 because you can't factor unless it's equal to 0. Factor however it looks like it needs to be factored, either regular factoring or slide and divide. And then set each parentheses equal to 0. So here's my problem, 3x squared equals 16x plus 12. I'm going to get everything on one side first. That's why we need to get everything equal to 0. So I'm going to subtract 16x, I'm going to subtract 12, and I get 3x squared minus 16x minus 12 equals 0. At that point, I'm now ready to start factoring my problem. Okay, so I'm not going to change anything on the 0 side for a while, and I'm just going to look at this term on the left side. If I have 3 and 16 and 12, 3 does not go into 16, so I don't have a greatest common factor, which means I need to slide and divide this problem. So I'm going to slide my 3 over my 12, make my new expression, x squared minus 16x minus 36, factor that. So what 2 numbers make 36 and add to 16? That makes the 2 and the 18. And then I'm going to go through and undo my slide by dividing. So I divide my 2 by 3 and my 18 by 3. Remember, because I slid the 3. 18 by 3 comes out evenly. It makes 6. 2 divided by 3 does not come out evenly, so I'm going to move that denominator up front. So when I factored 3x squared minus 16x minus 12, I get 3x plus 2, x minus 6. Now, if you're getting to this point and you're still confused about how I got that, you need to go back to those factoring sections and you need to practice your factoring. For this problem, especially slide and divide. But if you can't do through that last purple line and you don't understand where all of that came from, you have to go back and practice that factoring because that's the big key here. Okay? Now, once you've factored, we want to say, okay, well, that's great. Now I have a bunch of parentheses. How do I find those solutions? So I'm going to take each parentheses and I'm going to set them equal to 0. So I take 3x plus 2, set it equal to 0, and x minus 6, set it equal to 0. That's going to give me my 2 answers. 3x plus 2 equals 0. I'm going to subtract 2 and divide by 3. That's how I get negative 2/3. X minus 6, I'm going to add 6 to both sides, and then I get my answer is 6. So my 2 answers for this problem are negative 2/3 and 6. You can write them in either order. And that's where your graph would cross the x-axis. Okay? So once again, for these factoring problems, if you don't know how to factor, you're going to be careful and go back to those factoring sections first so you know how to factor. All right, there's some optional practice below, and we will talk about another way to solve quadratics with equations after this.